Why the hell is this delaying my flight? The man's voice tore through the commercial airline cabin, sharp and impatient, slicing straight through the boarding chime as if it didn't belong there. I didn't pay first-class money to sit behind a dying woman and her little pity project. The words landed like broken glass. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The low, polite rhythm of boarding collapsed into an uncomfortable stillness. The man was Richard Harlan, mid-40s, white, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed, sitting rigidly in the first-class cabin. Everything about him projected authority. The tailored blazer, the polished watch he checked with exaggerated annoyance, the certainty that his time mattered more than anyone else's. A few rows behind him, frozen under the aisle light, stood Naomi Carter, 9 years old, dark-skinned, small for her age, her neat braids pulled back with a worn blue ribbon. Her hands were clenched tightly around her, mother's fingers gripping as if letting go would make the world tilt. Her mother, Angela Carter, 38, black, visibly ill, slumped weakly in her seat. Sweat clung to her forehead. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, every inhale sounding like it scraped painfully through her chest. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Naomi felt every stare settle on her skin. Richard leaned farther into the aisle, his mouth twisting with disgust. "This isn't a hospital," he continued loudly. "If she was sick, she shouldn't have boarded. That's basic airline policy. Rules exist for a reason." Naomi swallowed, her throat burning. "Sir," she said softly, forcing the words out, "my mom needs help. She can't breathe." Richard let out a short, cruel laugh. "Oh, please," he said. "Here we go. The emotional routine. That's not how passenger rights work, sweetheart. You don't get to hold an entire plane hostage because you planned poorly." A few passengers shifted in. Their seats. Someone stared down at their phone. Someone else pretended to adjust a bag. No one intervened. A flight attendant hovered nearby, her professional smile tight, eyes darting between the man and the child. "Sir," the attendant said carefully, "we're assessing the situation." "Assess it faster," Richard snapped, "because I have places to be, real responsibilities, not this." He gestured openly at Angela, his voice dripping with contempt. "Dragging a dying body onto a plane like it's some sympathy prop," he muttered. Naomi felt her chest tighten painfully. "She didn't choose this," Naomi said, her voice cracking. "She followed the rules. She bought a ticket. She didn't do anything wrong." Richard leaned forward and pointed directly at her. "You people always say that," he sneered. "Always expecting exceptions. Always slowing things down for everyone else." The phrase "you people" fell heavy and unmistakable. Angela coughed violently, her body jerking forward. A wet, frightening sound tore from her throat. Naomi gasped as her mother's head collapsed against her shoulder. "Mom!" Naomi whispered urgently. "Mom, stay with me! Please!" The flight attendant took a step closer now, panic flickering across her face. Richard rolled his eyes again, louder this time. "Unbelievable," he said. "This airline is completely out of control." Naomi felt something rise in her. Fear, yes, but also something steadier. Something that refused to disappear, even when the room seemed to shrink around her. She slipped out of her seat. Slowly. The aisle felt longer than it was. Her shoes barely touched the carpet as she stood fully, her knees trembling, her small body exposed beneath the cabin lights. "My mom is dying," Naomi said, louder now. "Please, she needs help." Richard scoffed. "Oh, come on," he said. "What is this now? A performance?" Naomi didn't look at him. She knelt, right there in the aisle. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Phones lifted instinctively. A woman covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Richard shook his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Naomi clasped her hands together, her fingers shaking as they locked. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "God," she said softly, clearly, her words carrying through the stunned cabin. Please help my mom breathe. Please don't let her be alone. Please forgive the people who are being mean because they don't understand." The cabin froze. Even the hum of the aircraft seemed to fade. Naomi bowed her head, tears spilling freely now, soaking into the carpet beneath her knees. But she did not move. Richard opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. For the first time since boarding, his voice failed him. The flight attendant's eyes filled with tears. Phones continued recording. And in that heavy, unbearable silence, something irreversible began. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Matthew 5:5. If you've ever been humiliated, silenced, or treated as disposable, then what happens next with Naomi Carter will stay with you. Like, subscribe and stay with Dignity Voices to follow what happens when quiet faith collides with unchecked privilege. Because Richard Harlan believes authority belongs to the loudest voice, and in the next, he's about to push that belief too far. The silence Naomi's prayer left behind did not calm the cabin. It sharpened it. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The plane seemed suspended between moments, caught in an uncomfortable stillness that pressed against every chest. Naomi remained kneeling in the aisle, her hands clasped tightly, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. Angela's breaths came shallow and uneven beside her, each one thinner than the last. Richard Harlan broke the silence with a slow, deliberate clap. Once, then again. "Well," he said dryly, leaning back in his wide leather seat. That was dramatic. A few passengers flinched. Someone whispered under their breath. Phones remained raised, no longer hidden. Naomi didn't look up. Richard exhaled loudly, as if burdened by everyone else's emotions. "This is exactly what I mean," he continued, his voice rising with irritation. "You let this kind of thing go on, and suddenly it's chaos. Tears, prayers, guilt trips." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is a commercial airline. Not a church, not a hospital, and definitely not a place for public breakdowns." The flight attendant stood frozen a few steps away, tablet clutched tightly against her chest. Her eyes flicked from Naomi to Richard, then back again, caught between compassion and consequence. "Sir," she said carefully, "we're still evaluating the situation." "Evaluating? What?" Richard snapped. "She's been evaluating for 10 minutes now." He pointed openly toward Naomi and Angela. "That child is disrupting cabin order, and her mother," he paused, selecting his words with calculated cruelty, "is clearly unfit to fly." A sharp breath rippled through the cabin. Naomi lifted her head. "She didn't get sick on purpose," Naomi said quietly. "She was okay when we boarded." Richard rolled his eyes. "They're always okay until it's inconvenient," he replied. "Funny how that works." Angela coughed violently again, her body convulsing. Naomi instinctively wrapped her arms around her mother as her head collapsed against Naomi's shoulder. "Mom," Naomi whispered urgently, "I'm here. I've got you." The flight attendant dropped to one knee now, urgency breaking through her training. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight, "can you tell me your name?" Before Angela could respond, Richard stood, fully. The movement drew every eye. "This has gone far enough," he announced loudly. "I want this documented. I want names, and I want this handled immediately." He turned toward the flight attendant. "You understand airline policy, don't you? Medical diversions cost tens of thousands. You don't initiate them just because a child is emotional." Naomi's hands clenched. "She's not emotional," Naomi said, her voice shaking. "She's dying." Richard laughed. Not loud, not theatrical. Worse, dismissive. "Then she should have thought about that before flying," he said coldly. A woman several rows back whispered, "That's heartless." Richard snapped toward her instantly. "Mind your business," he barked, "unless you're paying for this delay." The woman shrank back into her seat, face pale. Phones were openly recording now, Naomi noticed. She noticed the way the flight attendant hesitated. She noticed the way passengers looked torn between sympathy and fear. She noticed how Richard's confidence grew with every second no one stopped him. Angela's breathing slowed again. Too slow. "Please," Naomi whispered, looking up at the attendant. "She needs oxygen." The attendant hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. That hesitation told Richard everything. He smiled. "There it is," he said quietly. "Indecision. That's how lawsuits happen." Then he raised his voice again. "I'm invoking my passenger rights," he said clearly. "This situation makes me feel unsafe. I want security involved now." The word security struck Naomi like a blow. "No," Naomi said quickly, panic flooding her voice. "Please don't do that. We didn't do anything wrong." Richard looked down at her, his face hard. "Sit down," he said flatly. "Adults are talking." Naomi froze. Angela stirred weakly. "Baby?" Angela whispered faintly. "I'm here," Naomi said, tears spilling freely now. "I'm not leaving you." The flight attendant swallowed hard and turned away slightly, tapping rapidly on her tablet, requesting guidance, authorization, escalation. Each request traveled upward through invisible systems instead of outward to the problem. The engines hummed softly. The plane remained motionless. Richard reclined his seat with a satisfied sigh. "See?" he said. "Handled." Naomi felt something inside her crack. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. She bowed her head again, pressing her forehead gently against her clasped hands. "God," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "Please don't let her go yet." The cabin watched. No one spoke. The stillness was suffocating. Richard closed his eyes, convinced the moment had passed, convinced control had been restored. He was wrong. Naomi lifted her head slowly and looked toward the cockpit door. She didn't know what she expected to find there. Only that waiting had failed, and something else had to begin. If you've ever watched injustice grow stronger simply because no one stopped it, stay with Dignity Voices. Like and subscribe, because what happens next will push cruelty into the open where it can no longer hide. Because Richard Harlan is no longer satisfied with control, he will demand obedience in front of everyone. The moment Naomi Carter lifted her head and looked toward the cockpit, Richard Harlan felt something he didn't like. Loss of control. He straightened in his seat and pressed the call button once, then again, then again. The chime echoed sharply through the cabin, cutting into the silence Naomi's prayer had left behind. Heads turned immediately. The sound carried authority. Not official authority, but the kind people had learned to obey. "This is unacceptable," Richard announced, standing fully now, his voice loud enough to travel beyond first class. "Absolutely unacceptable." The flight attendant turned back toward him. Her face had lost its practiced calm. Her eyes flicked toward Naomi, then back to Richard. "Sir," she said, "please lower your voice." "No," Richard snapped. "I want this recorded. I want names. I want this handled properly because what's happening right now is corporate negligence." The phrase landed hard. A murmur moved through the cabin. Phones rose higher. People stopped pretending not to watch. Naomi's stomach dropped. She stayed kneeling beside her mother, one arm wrapped tightly around Angela Carter's shoulders. Angela's body felt heavier now, her head resting against Naomi's chest, her breathing shallow and delayed, each inhale uncertain. Richard pointed openly. "That child," he said, jabbing the air without hesitation, "is interfering with cabin operations. And that woman," his mouth twisted, "is medically unfit to fly." A sharp gasp rippled through the rows. Naomi lifted her head, slowly. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "My mom needs help." Richard laughed, not loudly, worse, dismissively. "Needs help?" he repeated. "Or needs attention?" He turned toward the surrounding passengers, spreading his hands as if presenting evidence. "Let's be honest. If every sick person delayed a flight, nothing would ever leave the ground. There are rules, there are systems, and those systems exist to stop chaos like this. He looked back down at Naomi. You don't get to override them because you're emotional. Angela coughed violently again, her body convulsing. A wet, frightening wheeze tore from her chest. Naomi tightened her grip instinctively. Mom, Naomi whispered, panic breaking through her restraint. Please, please breathe. The flight attendant stepped closer, voice urgent now. Ma'am, she said, kneeling. Can you hear me? Before Angela could answer, Richard took another step forward, inserting himself into the space. This is unsafe, he declared, and I'm not going to sit here while this airline risks my schedule and my safety. He turned sharply to the attendant. You're trained, right? Then act like it. Either remove the problem or I will escalate this. The word remove sliced through the air. Naomi froze. Please, she said, looking up at the attendant. She's dying. Richard didn't hesitate. Then she shouldn't have flown, he replied coldly. That's not my responsibility. A man across the aisle stood halfway up. Hey, the man said, voice shaking. That's someone's mother. Richard turned on him instantly. Sit down, he barked. Unless you're a doctor or a lawyer, you're irrelevant. The man hesitated, then slowly sat back down, his face flushed with shame. The humiliation deepened. Not just Naomi's, everyone's. The flight attendant swallowed, hard. Sir, she said again, I need you to return to your seat. Richard laughed sharply. You really want to push this? He said. Because I promise you, I understand legal accountability better than you do. He raised his voice deliberately. I'm invoking my passenger rights. This situation makes me feel unsafe. I want security involved, now. The word security hit Naomi like a blow. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. Please don't do that. We didn't do anything wrong. Richard looked down at her, his expression flat, almost bored. Sit down, he said. Adults are talking. Naomi felt the room tilt. Angela stirred weakly. Baby, Angela whispered. I'm here, Naomi said, tears spilling freely now. I'm not leaving you. The flight attendant turned away slightly, tapping rapidly on her tablet. Escalation requests, supervisor alerts, policy confirmations. Every tap meant delay. Richard folded his arms, satisfied. See? He said. Procedure. Time stretched unbearably. Angela's breathing slowed again. Naomi felt terror claw up her throat. She looked around the cabin, at the raised phones, the rigid faces, the people watching her be stripped of dignity in real time. Something inside her hardened. She stood, slowly. Her knees shook, but she remained upright, one hand braced against the seat, the other holding her mother's. My mom trusted this airline, Naomi said, louder now, her voice cracking but strong. She followed the rules. She trusted you. She looked directly at the flight attendant. Please, she said, don't let them pretend this isn't happening. Richard scoffed. Oh, listen to her, he said mockingly. She's given a speech now. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, then cut out abruptly. Static filled the cabin. Naomi didn't know why, but she felt it. The air had changed. Richard felt it too. If this airline has any sense, he said loudly, they'll remove the problem and move on. Otherwise, they'll be answering for this. Publicly. He smiled thinly. Because this is how legal accountability works. Phones captured everything. Naomi knelt again. Not in defeat. In faith. She clasped her hands, her voice shaking but clear. God, she said, you see us. You know the truth. Please help the people who are hurting us understand what they're doing. The cabin fell into stunned silence. Even Richard stopped speaking. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty flickered across his face. Because prayer did not ask permission, and humiliation had finally reached its limit. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. If you've ever watched cruelty grow stronger because silence protected it, stay with Dignity Voices. Like and subscribe, because what happens next will shift the balance of power. Because Richard Harlan believes humiliation ends resistance, but in the next silence we'll begin dismantling him. The cabin did not erupt. It didn't argue. It didn't applaud. It didn't rush in to fix anything. It went still. Naomi remained kneeling in the aisle, her hands clasped so tightly her fingers ached. Her prayer had ended, but its presence lingered, hanging in the air like something unfinished. Her shoulders rose and fell slowly now, not because the fear was gone, but because she had chosen to breathe through it. Angela lay against the seat beside her, eyes closed, lips parted slightly. Her chest barely moved. Naomi reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her mother's forehead, gentle, reverent, as if any sudden motion might disturb something fragile holding on by will alone. No one spoke. Phones remained raised, but they no longer felt intrusive. They felt like witnesses who had stumbled into something too real to interrupt. Richard Harlan shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a short laugh, "that was dramatic." No one responded. He glanced around, searching for affirmation. He found none. The flight attendant stood a few steps away, frozen, her tablet hanging uselessly at her side. For the first time since boarding, she was not looking at Richard. She was looking at Naomi, really looking, at the way the child's hands no longer shook, at the way her posture held firm without defiance, at the way she had absorbed humiliation without returning it. The attendant swallowed hard. She took one step forward, then another. She knelt, not beside Naomi, not intruding, but close enough to be present. "What's your mom's name?" she asked softly. Naomi looked up. Her eyes met the attendant's. There was no accusation in them, no anger, just truth. "Angela," Naomi said quietly. The attendant nodded, typing quickly now, fingers steadier than before. "I should have acted sooner," she said under her breath, not as a performance, not for forgiveness, but because the truth demanded to be spoken aloud. Richard scoffed. "Oh, now you grow a conscience?" he muttered. "Unbelievable." The attendant didn't look at him. That was new. She stood and turned toward the cockpit door. Naomi watched her go, heart pounding, hope flickering dangerously. Richard noticed the shift. "Hey!" he snapped. "Where do you think you're going?" The attendant paused, turned just enough to acknowledge him. "To do my job," she said. The words were quiet. They carried weight. The cabin felt heavier. Richard stood again, agitation sharpening his movements. "This is getting ridiculous," he said loudly. "We're not turning this into a circus because of feelings." A passenger near the window spoke softly, almost to themselves. "It already is." Richard spun toward the voice. "What did you say?" Nothing followed. Silence answered him. Naomi squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Angela stirred faintly, her lips moving. "Baby," she breathed. "I know," Naomi said, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I know." The cockpit door opened. The sound was subtle, but it cut through the stillness like a line drawn in ink. The captain stepped out. He didn't rush. He didn't scan the cabin for control. He took in the scene slowly. The kneeling child, the slumped woman, the raised phones, the man standing too tall in first class. His eyes landed on Naomi. They held. No words passed between them. None were needed. Naomi did not speak. She did not plead. She did not explain. She simply held his gaze. And in that moment, something transferred. Recognition, responsibility, truth. The captain inhaled slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, his voice firm but unraised. "Please remain seated." Richard opened his mouth. The captain raised a hand. Not sharply, not angrily, just enough. "Sir," he said evenly, "I need you to sit down." The authority in his tone was unmistakable. Richard hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he obeyed. The cabin released a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. The captain stepped closer, listening as the flight attendant spoke quickly, urgently, pointing toward Angela, explaining the delay, the hesitation, the failure. The captain nodded once. He knelt briefly beside Angela, assessing with his eyes, his expression tightening. He stood again and looked at Naomi. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Naomi blinked, surprised. No one had said that yet. The captain turned back toward the cockpit. "We are not moving," he said simply. The words landed without ceremony. Richard stiffened. "You can't be serious," he said sharply. The captain turned to him. "I am," he replied. The cabin remained silent. No one challenged it. No one needed to. Naomi stayed kneeling, not in weakness now, but in choice. Her breathing steadied. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned the room. Richard crossed his arms tightly, jaw clenched, eyes darting as if searching for leverage that had slipped through his fingers. For the first time since boarding, he was not in control of the narrative. The captain returned to the cockpit. The door closed. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't suffocating. It was expectant. Naomi bowed her head slightly, resting her forehead against her clasped hands. She did not pray aloud this time. She waited, because silence, true silence, was finally doing the work. The cabin did not erupt when the captain stepped forward. It didn't gasp. It didn't whisper. It held its breath. Naomi Carter remained kneeling beside her mother, her hands resting gently on Angela's forearm, counting each fragile rise and fall of her chest. Angela's breathing was shallow now, labored, as if each breath had to be negotiated with her body before it was allowed through. The flight attendant stood nearby, no longer hovering, no longer frozen. Her tablet hung uselessly at her side. Her eyes stayed on the captain, waiting for direction that had been too long in coming. Richard Harlan broke the silence first, his voice sharp with irritation. "So what is this supposed to be?" he demanded. "A pause? A show of sympathy? Because we've wasted enough time." The captain turned slowly toward him. "Sir," he said evenly, "this aircraft is not moving." The words landed hard. Richard blinked, then laughed once, short and incredulous. "You can't be serious," he said. "On what grounds?" The captain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside Angela. The movement alone shifted the room. He did not touch her without permission. He observed her, breathing, her color, the way Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she held on. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. He stood again. "On the grounds," he said calmly, "that a passenger is experiencing a medical emergency that was not addressed with the urgency required." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Richard scoffed. "You're buying into this now, too?" The captain faced him fully. "No," he replied. "I'm correcting a failure." The word failure echoed louder than any insult that had come before. Phones lifted higher. The flight attendant swallowed hard. Richard straightened in his seat, calculation replacing contempt. "You do realize what you're saying," he replied. "That's an admission. That's corporate negligence." "Yes," the captain said without hesitation. "It is." The cabin inhaled collectively. Richard froze. He hadn't expected agreement. The captain continued, his voice steady, carrying, without effort. "We delayed medical response. We allowed intimidation to influence judgment, and we failed to act when it mattered." He paused. "That ends now." Naomi felt something inside her loosen, not relief yet, but possibility. The captain turned toward her. "Medical services are already en route to the gate," he said gently. "We are returning immediately." Naomi's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back, afraid that showing too much might break the moment. "Thank you," she whispered. The captain nodded once. Then he turned back to Richard. "Sir," he said, "I need you to gather your belongings." Richard stared at him. "What?" "You are being removed from this flight," the captain continued evenly. "Your conduct interfered with emergency response, escalated distress, and contributed to delay." "That's ridiculous," Richard snapped. "I have passenger rights." "So does she," the captain replied, gesturing toward Naomi and Angela. "And hers were ignored." Richard's face flushed red. "You're choosing them over me," he said, incredulous. "No," the captain said. "I'm choosing responsibility." Richard stood abruptly, anger flaring. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he warned. "This will cost you. This airline will regret this." The captain held his gaze. "It already has," he said quietly. "And it will cost us more if we pretend otherwise." Two crew members stepped forward, calm and procedural. "Sir," one said, "please come with us." Richard hesitated, scanning the cabin for support. He found none. Passengers looked away, not in fear now, but in judgment. Phones continued recording, capturing his walk down the aisle, his posture shrinking with every step. As he passed Naomi, he leaned in slightly. "This isn't over," he muttered. Naomi did not look at him. She was watching her mother. The aircraft began its slow turn back toward the gate, the movement subtle but unmistakable. An announcement followed, brief, factual, stripped of apology or excuse. Minutes later, the cabin door opened. Paramedics boarded with quiet urgency. Oxygen tanks hissed softly as they knelt beside Angela, fitting a mask, checking vitals, speaking in low, controlled tones. Naomi stepped back only when asked, her hands lingering until the last possible moment. "She's strong," one paramedic said gently. "You did the right thing." Naomi nodded, tears finally spilling now that she no longer had to be strong. As Angela was lifted onto the stretcher, Naomi walked beside her, holding her hand. Before exiting the aircraft, Naomi stopped. She turned back toward the cabin. Every eye was on her. Not with curiosity, not with pity, with recognition. Naomi did not smile. She did not wave. She bowed her head slightly, not in victory, not in gratitude, in dignity. The doors closed behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, reflective, irreversible. Because the truth had been unveiled, not by shouting, not by power, but by endurance. If you've ever wondered whether quiet courage can still force the truth into the open, stay with Dignity Voices. Like and subscribe, because what happens next isn't about one man being removed. It's about what the system does when it's exposed. Because in the next, accountability will move beyond this cabin, and the institution itself will be forced to answer. The aircraft remained at the gate long after the stretcher disappeared down the jet bridge. Not because anyone forgot about the passengers, because the system had finally noticed itself. Inside the cockpit, the captain removed his headset and set it carefully on the console. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if placing it down carried weight. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, understanding that the authority it represented had been tested, and bet that it had nearly failed. He exhaled. Then he reached for the internal phone. "Operations," he said when the line connected. "This is the captain of Flight 318. I'm initiating a priority incident report." The response on the other end sharpened instantly. "Go ahead." "Passenger medical emergency," the captain continued evenly. "Delayed response, passenger interference, crew hesitation." A pause. "Was medical intervention eventually provided?" the voice asked. "Yes," the captain replied, "but not when it should have been." Another pause, longer this time. "Document everything," the voice said. "Timestamps, crew statements, passenger behavior." "I already am," the captain replied. He ended the call and dialed again. Risk management, then legal affairs, then executive duty oversight. Each conversation followed the same pattern. No excuses, no softened language, no shifting blame. He described the event exactly as it happened, including his own delay in stepping out of the cockpit. Each sentence felt like placing another weight onto a scale that had been uneven for far too long. Outside the cockpit, the cabin remained unusually still. Passengers whispered quietly, no longer speculating, no longer gossiping, processing. Many stared at their phones as videos spread outward, no longer contained by the walls of the aircraft. "Is this your flight? This is everywhere. What airline is this?" The flight attendant sat alone in the jump seat, her tablet resting unused in her lap. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline had drained away. She replayed the moment she had hesitated, not once, but repeatedly, waiting for permission that should never have been required. She looked up when the captain approached. "I should have acted faster," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. Then, after a beat, "And now, we tell the truth." She nodded, swallowing hard. In the terminal, airport, operations had already arrived at the gate. A senior operations manager stood beneath the departure screen, scrolling through internal alerts that had multiplied faster than she could read them. Incident flagged, media exposure confirmed, regulatory attention likely. She stepped onto the aircraft, her heels echoing too loudly against the cabin floor. Passengers watched her pass in silence. She stopped near the row where Naomi and Angela had been seated. She did not touch the seat. She did not speak immediately. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice tight. "This should not have happened." No one responded. An apology without repair felt incomplete. She turned toward the captain. "We are grounding this aircraft," she said. "Full review, no departure." He nodded once. That decision alone would cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, and everyone in the room knew it. In a glass-walled conference room several floors above the terminal, screens lit, up one by one as executives joined an emergency call. Some were still traveling. Some had been pulled from sleep. All were watching the same footage, raw, unedited, unforgiving. The kneeling child, the standing man, the delay. No commentary was needed. Legal counsel spoke first. "This meets the threshold for regulatory scrutiny," they said. "Failure to follow emergency response protocols, passenger intimidation, delay in care." Another executive rubbed their temples. "This is going to be public." "It already is," someone replied. The CEO had not spoken yet. She leaned forward slowly. "We are not minimizing this," she said. "We are not isolating it as a misunderstanding. And we are not blaming crew for following an unclear system." She paused. "This is a systems failure." The words settled heavily in the room. "Then we fix the system," she continued. Decisions followed quickly. Immediate suspension of cabin class escalation. Privileges, clarification of emergency authority across all flights. Mandatory retraining for medical response without supervisor delay. Each decision carried cost. Each cost was accepted. Back at the airport, the captain sat alone in the cockpit, watching the runway lights blur through the windshield. He knew what would come next. Interviews, statements, possibly discipline. He accepted all of it. The flight attendant joined him quietly. "They're calling it a protocol overhaul," she said. "It should have been," he replied. Across town, in a hospital room filled with soft beeping and filtered light, Naomi sat beside her mother's bed. Angela's breathing was steadier now, oxygen hissing softly at her side. Her color had improved slightly, not healed, but present. Naomi held her hand with both of hers. "You did good," Angela whispered faintly. Naomi shook her head. "I just stayed." Angela smiled weakly. That was enough. Back at headquarters, the airline's first public statement went live. No euphemisms, no legal fog. An admission, a failure, a commitment. The wording was careful, but the responsibility was clear. The video continued to spread, but now it traveled alongside the airline's response. The narrative began to shift, from outrage to reckoning. The system had been forced to look at itself, and for once, it did not look away. The story did not explode, it spread. Quietly at first, almost politely, the way institutional failure always does before it becomes impossible to contain. A video link appeared in a group chat, then another, then a short clip embedded in a news alert, stripped of commentary, allowed to speak for itself. By dawn, the footage had crossed every boundary the cabin once enforced. Airport terminals replayed it on muted screens. Morning news programs ran it without panel debate. Corporate compliance inboxes filled with subject lines marked urgent. Legal teams across industries watched not out of curiosity, but recognition. A system had failed in public. Inside the airline's headquarters, the workday began without pleasantries. The lobby remained quiet. Security badges scanned without conversation. Elevators filled with people reading the same internal alert on their phones, eyes lowered, expressions stiff. Conference rooms locked early. The first meeting was not about messaging. It was about exposure. Legal counsel projected a timeline across the glass wall, each minute marked with clinical precision. The delay between initial distress and medical intervention glowed in red. The escalation ladder appeared beside it, showing requests moving upward instead of outward, authority bottlenecked by hierarchy. Words repeated across the screen: delay, deference, hesitation. No one called it misconduct. That would imply intent. They called it systemic vulnerability. At 9:14 a.m., the first regulatory inquiry arrived. Not informal, not exploratory. Formal. The request was concise and exhaustive. Full crew logs, internal communications, training protocols, medical escalation policy, passenger interference response guidelines. Originals only. No summaries. No interpretation. The airline acknowledged receipt within 3 minutes. At 9:22 a.m., the second inquiry arrived. By 9:30, there were 4. In the executive suite, the CEO watched the unedited footage again, this time without sound and without company. She did not pause it. She did not look away. The absence of audio made the failure more severe, not less. There was no shouting to distract from posture, no dialogue to dilute responsibility. Only sequence. A child kneeling, an adult standing, a system waiting. She closed the file and called the board chair. "We're not controlling this," she said. "We're answering for it." At 10:05 a.m., the first internal suspension memo was drafted. It was narrow in language, temporary in scope, careful not to assign blame, prematurely. Still, the message traveled quickly. People noticed who was removed from distribution lists. At 10:47 a.m., the airline's risk committee convened, not for optics, for exposure modeling. The projected financial impact filled the screen in layers: grounded aircraft costs, regulatory penalties, litigation risk, retraining expenditures, reputational drag. No one reacted emotionally. This was not shock. It was arithmetic. One executive spoke quietly. The cost of doing nothing would have been higher. No one disagreed. By noon, the public statement was rewritten for the third time. The earlier versions were discarded, not because they were inaccurate, but because they were insufficient. This one acknowledged delay. This one acknowledged intimidation. This one acknowledged that procedure had been allowed to override urgency. The statement avoided apology language that implied finality. Instead, it committed to process, oversight, and measurable change. It did not ask forgiveness. It accepted responsibility. Media response adjusted immediately. Headlines hardened. Tone shifted from outrage to audit. Analysts stopped asking what happened and began asking what changes. By early afternoon, attention narrowed. Not to the airline as a whole, to patterns. Journalists began connecting dots. Past complaints resurfaced, previously dismissed as isolated. Training materials were reviewed. Industry experts were invited not to speculate, but to contextualize. "This isn't unusual," one said on air. "It's just rarely visible." The phrase echoed. Rarely visible. Internally, interviews began. Crew members were not interrogated. They were documented. Each spoke under the same instruction. Speak accurately, not defensively. Many described the same instinct: waiting for permission, checking hierarchy, deferring to perceived power. None described malice, all described fear. The review committee wrote that word down repeatedly. Fear of complaints, fear of escalation, fear of getting it wrong. Fear had become policy. At 3:18 p.m., the airline issued a grounding notice on the aircraft involved, extending it indefinitely pending review. The financial loss was immediate and measurable. The decision was not debated. Visibility required sacrifice. In parallel, quiet distancing began elsewhere. A law firm removed a name from its website. A conference organizer updated a speaker list. A foundation postponed a partnership announcement. No public condemnation, just subtraction. By evening, the airline released an internal directive. Emergency authority was being redistributed. Medical escalation no longer required supervisory approval. Cabin hierarchy would not override care. Training modules were suspended pending rewrite. The language was procedural. The implication was not. That night, in a hospital room far from boardrooms and screens, Naomi sat beside her mother's bed. Machines hummed steadily. Angela slept, her breathing supported but present. Naomi watched the rise and fall of her chest with the seriousness of someone who had learned too early how fragile time could be. She did not know about regulators. She did not know about memos. She knew only that the room was quiet and that her mother was still there. A nurse entered softly and adjusted a line. "You did what you were supposed to do," the nurse said gently. Naomi shook her head. "I just didn't move," she replied. The nurse nodded, as if that explained everything. Back at headquarters, the CEO signed off on the final action plan at 11:42 p.m. It included third-party oversight, public reporting timelines, and compliance audits that would extend years beyond the news cycle. The cost projections updated automatically. She signed anyway. The last internal communication of the day went out without branding or polish. It was addressed simply to all employees. It read, "When urgency is delayed, harm occurs." This organization will be measured by how it responds, not by how it explains. No one replied. They read it. Late-night news reran the footage one final time, now framed by analysis instead of emotion. A legal expert summarized it succinctly. "This wasn't about one man," she said. "It was about a system that learned, too late, that neutrality is not protection." The clip ended. The system did not collapse loudly. It did not shatter. It recalibrated under pressure, layer by layer, document by document, authority by authority. And when it finished recalibrating, the old version of itself no longer existed. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought to light. Luke 8:17. No forgiveness yet, no healing yet, only truth standing where silence used to be. The airport did not feel triumphant. It felt settled. Morning light filtered through the tall glass walls of the terminal, stretching across polished floors where footsteps passed without urgency. Rolling suitcases hummed softly, voices overlapped and faded, and departure boards flickered with destinations that mattered deeply to someone and not at all to anyone else. Life moved forward the way it always did, unaware that something important had already happened here. Naomi Carter noticed everything. She stood near the gate with her hands folded in front of her, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. She was still small for her age, still young, but there was a calm about her now that had not existed before. Not confidence, not pride. Something quieter, something earned. Beside her stood Angela Carter, thinner than before, slower in her movements, but standing, alive. Angela leaned lightly on a cane the doctors insisted she use, even though she hated it. Her breathing was no longer a struggle. Each inhale came naturally now, unforced. Her eyes, though tired, were clear. Naomi looked up at her mother. "You sure? You're okay?" Naomi asked. Angela smiled softly. "I am, and I will be." They did not rush when boarding was announced. For the first time in days, time did not feel like an enemy. It waited patiently with them. Near the boarding counter, a small plaque had been installed. It was not polished or dramatic. Most passengers walked past it without seeing it at all. Naomi saw it immediately. This gate affirms dignity, timely care, and the responsibility to act when it matters. No names, no dates, no explanation. Naomi read it slowly. Each word felt heavier than the last, not because of what it said, but because of what it remembered. Angela placed a gentle hand on Naomi's shoulder. They listened, Angela said quietly. Yes, Naomi replied. After. Angela nodded. Sometimes justice comes late. What matters is that it comes. Since the night of the flight, many things had happened quietly. Lawyers had spoken without raising their voices. Documents had been reviewed line by line. A settlement agreement had been reached without spectacle, not framed as generosity, but as responsibility. Medical expenses were covered fully. Ongoing care was secured. No conditions were attached. No silence was demanded. Angela had insisted on reading every word before signing. This isn't compensation, she had said calmly. This is accountability. There had also been an executive apology, not a press conference, not a carefully staged statement. A letter, handwritten, direct. It named failure without excuses and committed to change without embellishment. Naomi had watched her mother read it twice. She didn't ask for forgiveness, Angela had said afterward. She accepted responsibility. That matters. Inside the airline, teams worked through long nights on reputation management, but even they understood that no strategy could erase what had happened. The story would live on, not in headlines, but in new procedures, revised. Training and decisions made faster next time. Brand accountability became more than language. It became structure. Authority was clarified. Emergency response was rewritten. Silence was no longer an option the system could choose. But Naomi did not think about policy as the boarding group was called. She and her mother stepped forward together. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. No one delayed them. As they walked down the jet bridge, Naomi paused and placed her hand against the wall. It was cool beneath her palm, solid and real. The hum of the terminal faded behind her. Angela noticed. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Naomi took a moment before answering. "I was really scared," she said honestly. "But I stayed," Angela smiled, and that changed everything. They took their seats on the plane. Not first class, not anything special. Just seats. Ordinary. Equal. Naomi buckled herself in carefully, the way she always did. As the aircraft prepared for departure, Naomi looked out the window. The runway stretched long and open ahead of them, disappearing into light. She remembered another runway, another wait, another silence. This time, the silence felt peaceful. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky. No tension, no delay, no raised voices, just movement. Later, much later, Naomi would learn words for what had happened: legal accountability, institutional reform, systemic change. She would understand how rare it was for power to admit fault and how necessary it was when it did. But she would never forget the simpler truth. That dignity does not shout. That faith does not demand proof. That courage can kneel and still move the world. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6:8. If you've ever felt small in a system that felt too big, if you've ever waited for help while silence answered, first, if you've ever wondered whether quiet faith still matters in a loud world, this story is for you. Dignity Voices exists to tell stories where justice does not come from dominance, but from endurance, where the smallest voice in the room can still change the direction of everything. If this story moved you, encouraged you, or reminded you of God's presence in moments that feel unbearable, please like, subscribe, and stay with Dignity Voices. Because every day, somewhere, quiet courage is still being tested. And sometimes, it only takes one person who refuses to walk away.